Chapter 4. Little Memories of Other Times. In those days of early childhood, there were bad times and there were good times. There were summer days when the sun beat on pavements until they shimmered, and barefoot children could be seen performing a macabre dance on the tips of their toes to try to keep their feet in the air as long as they could, away from the baking stones. Sometimes the stones were so hot that they would burn our feet. My feet were really sensitive. I couldn't bear it. Then there were summer days, when Herr Engel took his class out into the fields and made the school children lie on their backs in the long, cool grass, perfumed with the scent of wild flowers, and listen to lark song. We learned to touch beetles and worms, spiders, and all sorts of creepy crawlies. We learnt about the horizon, the scenery of Dresden, which was beautiful. We marked out, with our arms outstretched, the different hills and mountains of Dresden, always beginning with Borgsberg on the right, moving with our arms to the left until we knew it by heart, finishing, I believe, with the Lilienstein. We also went out each week with our tape measures to write down how much the corn had grown. He wanted to make us aware of things around us. With me, he succeeded. Those were lovely days. The pretty village of Grüne, east of Dresden's Grossergarten, consisted of little houses, a farm, and a village green. But the children from the Goldene Pforte Children's Home avoided going to school through the village. The village children teased and bullied them for being orphans. Whenever she could, Ruth took the longer route to the Volksschule, people's school, unlike the private schools that rich children attended, through park and fields. They were often late for school, though, because Ruth had to wait for Hans, who was always having trouble eating up his breakfast. Every morning, bowls brimming with coarse, lumpy porridge without any milk or sugar proved a battleground even for the most undernourished children. The oats were all still with their husks on, and we had to get the husks out of our mouths. The big plate had usually 2 rows on the edge, one husk neatly placed next to the other, like a yellow string of pearls. It was hard work, and we were hungry, but couldn't eat fast because of having to remove the husks. The porridge would get quite cold. When they arrived at school, they had to explain to the teacher why they were late, and would be in trouble again and again. In the children's home, the children were looked after by a team of aunts under the authority of the Hausmutter, a well-educated, clever woman who Ruth found rather frightening. She was very stern and was always asking Ruth what she was up to. Ruth avoided her as much as she could. Pastor Spranger, on the other hand, who was the director of several such children's homes, had a more kindly disposition. He was liked by all the children. One of the nicer aunts was a pretty young woman called Tante Paula. Part of her attraction, at least as far as Ruth was concerned, was that she had a piano. Almost as soon as they arrived, poor little motherless Hans fell in love with Tante Paula, who became for him his surrogate mother. Ruth fell head over heels in love with Tante Paula's piano. After 1 year, Tante Paula was offered the job as Hausmutter at another children's home, and she and her piano vanished. We were left behind. Hans really lost something there, whilst I could make acquaintance with an old harmonium with all its lovely stoppers which altered the sound. It needed pedalling, which was extra work for a 5-year-old. The children's home, known as the Golden Gate, or as Ruth preferred to call it, Rotemundschloss, became a victim of the bombing of Dresden in 1945. It was a large house, backing onto a small park and surrounded by trees. I don't know if it was known as a castle locally. After her early life in poor rented rooms, I think the transition to a large mansion house even if it was an institution, might have fired up Ruth's vivid imagination into believing that she lived in a castle. Perhaps that is what the children's home staff called it, to make the children feel better about living there. Whichever it was, the belief stayed with her all her life. She always loved big, spacious rooms like those she had grown used to in 10 years of life in the children's home. The boys and girls were accommodated in separate dormitories. The girls' rooms had religious tracts on the wall, probably to do with goodness and virtue. The boys' dormitories, on the other hand, were decorated with heroic battle scenes, armies vanquishing their enemies. The children were hungry most of the time. There was little food, and what they had was very unpalatable. But they were well dressed, even though the clothes they wore were second-hand. Many wealthy local families donated their outgrown but hardly outworn children's clothes to the home. The children were brought up to behave and speak well, and as they grew older were expected to do chores within the home or outside in the local community. They were given a firm grounding in Bible studies, knowledge which stayed with Ruth for the rest of her life. Even when she rejected religion entirely, she still remembered great chunks of the New Testament and could quote them better than many a practicing Christian. The children were also introduced to the German passion for walking in the woods and hills with groups of friends, singing lustily in luscious harmonies, a folk culture that was later hijacked by the Nazis and became so ridiculed by Germany's enemies. Somehow, in spite of all the deprivations and heartache that an institutionalized child must suffer, Ruth survived those years in the children's home with her optimism intact. There must have been times in her childhood when she despaired, many times when she cried. But it was in the very core of her nature to hope, and whenever possible to see the best side of any situation, an ability that stayed with her all her life. The corridor between the dormitories and the staff quarters was long. High windows lit the endless hallway. Ruth was on her knees scrubbing the tiled floor. She was hungry and her back ached. It was hard to imagine being rescued by a handsome prince when your hands were red and raw from the hard carbolic soap. Aschenputtel, Cinderella, made it, though, she thought. There's always hope. She stood up and moved the heavy bucket a few metres further on, taking the opportunity to stretch her back. She yawned and stood for a moment, dreamily watching dust motes dancing a slow-motion dance in shafts of sunlight. Then something on one of the window-sills caught her eye. It was a white dish, and on it was one golden banana, warm and fragrant. One of the aunts must have left it there on her way to her room and forgotten about it. Ruth had never eaten a banana. She looked up and down the corridor. Everything was quiet. She reached out and took it, quickly stuffing it into the pocket of her pinafore. She couldn't eat it here. She left the mop and bucket and the half-cleaned floor and hurried into the lavatory, locking the door. She peeled the banana, quickly stuffing it greedily into her mouth, hardly tasting its mellow sweetness in her hurry. Then she dropped the limp golden skin into the lavatory bowl and pulled the chain. Water gushed down, swirling around the pan. Ruth was just turning the key to leave when she noticed that the banana skin was still there, floating proof of her crime. She flushed again and again. Panic rose in her. In desperation, she pulled the chain once more. The banana skin was still there. It wouldn't flush away. Heart pounding, she lifted it out of the water and looked around for somewhere to hide it. There was a small gap between the shelf where the china potties were stored and the wall. The gap was dark and filled with spiders' webs. She tucked the banana skin deeply into the recess so that it couldn't be seen. Relieved at having disposed of the incriminating evidence, she went back to her cleaning. "I'm sure I left a banana somewhere." One of the aunts was coming down the corridor towards her. "Did you see a banana, Ruth? Here, on this dish?" Ruth shook her head. "No, the dish was empty." The aunt looked at her suspiciously, but said nothing. Later, someone else said that they saw the banana on the windowsill much later in the day, long after she'd eaten it, so she convinced herself that she couldn't have taken it after all, and her conscience was clear. "I had never before eaten a banana, but I have no recollection if I actually liked the taste. I ate it so quickly, I must have been too frightened to enjoy it." Bananas seemed to have been a recurring source of trouble for Ruth. I suppose that once she had a taste for them, they became a temptation too great to resist. The only fruit Ruth remembered ever being given at the children's home was once a year, when they were each given one orange at Christmas. So an opportunity to taste a banana again was an opportunity not to be missed. Friedel had hair as bright and beautiful as an angel's. Ruth watched in awe as the silvery gold strands threaded through the brush, gleaming like spun silk in the early morning sunlight. Ruth's hair was straight and black. She wore it in a short bob with a fringe. But Friedel's hair was plaited into neat flaxen braids that reached to her waist. How Ruth envied those braids! The two girls were best friends for most of Ruth's time at the children's home. But when Friedel Trapp and her brother first came to the children's home, Ruth was afraid of her. Friedel was a strong girl, but had been born with a physical disability. She had half an arm. She had an elbow, and then it went pointed, and there was a little knobble on the end. I didn't like it when she touched me with that. With that arm, she was very strong. But as well as her glorious hair, Friedel had another asset that made Ruth admire her more than any other girl in the children's home. For Friedel had the most dramatic imagination. She invented and she invented. She said there were flies who were actually a person. They changed themselves into a fly. We all played the game with her. For a long time, Ruth really believed that any fly that came into the room was a person who was watching them, who would fly off home and tell the rest of their family about the children they had seen in the Goldene Pforte children's home. After some years, Friedel's little brother died, and some time later, Friedel, who was not yet 14, left the children's home to go and work for her aunt, who ran a plant and flower nursery in Dresden. Her job was to fill a small handcart with plants and to deliver them to her aunt's customers. She was given her own room in her aunt's house and her keep, but for money she relied on tips from grateful customers. Because she only had one arm, many people felt sorry for her, so her tips were good. As Friedel's best friend, Ruth was invited to visit her several times in her new home. By then, Friedel had forgotten all about the fly and all those imaginary things. She was more matter-of-fact, and she showed me all the money she had collected. It was lots. I thought she was rich, but it was only coins, only pennies. Ruth had no idea about the value of money. It was something she had never had. She thought that Friedel was rich, having such a huge collection of coins. One day, the temptation became too great for the child who always had to do without. She took just one coin from the box while Friedel was out working. She didn't know what it was worth. It looked small and insignificant. Surely it wouldn't be missed amongst all those coins Friedel had collected, many of which were much bigger than the one she took. She went into the village. Throughout her childhood, and indeed her whole life, Ruth had a perpetual craving for fruit. So, armed with her coin, she bought herself some bananas. She thought that by buying bananas all the money would be gone. But to her surprise, she was given 6 more coins back in change. I didn't know the value at all. I had never handled money. I thought they had given me more back than I had given them. If you never deal with any, you don't know the value. So I got more and more, and had to buy more and more things. It became embarrassing. But Friedel wasn't stupid. She soon became aware that one of the most valuable coins was missing from her money box. What must she have thought of her friend? I knew at once there was money missing from my box. It was the most valuable coin, a 20-pfennig piece that Frau Hartmann had given me when I delivered the flowers for her daughter's wedding. At first I kept going through the coins over and over again. I couldn't believe that Ruth would do such a thing. But who else was there? Tante Trapp wouldn't take it. She always encouraged me to save my money. Anyway, she didn't need it. She is rich. I hated having to do it, but I had to ask Ruth. Did you take money from my box? No, of course not. I could tell from her face that she was lying. We've known each other since we were 5, for heaven's sake. Did she really think I wouldn't know? She looked so ashamed, but she kept on saying she hadn't taken it. It really made me mad with her. I'll never ever ask her here again. I thought she was my friend. I thought I could trust her. Ruth felt thoroughly ashamed and missed her former friend. She had few enough people who were close to her. I felt awful. I felt quite awful. I don't think she asked me there any more after that. I knew it was a bit naughty, but I didn't think it was so bad. I didn't know the value, but I lost my friend through it.